Great. Well, thank you, Marlon. Thank you, Sarah, for helping us put this together. Just to do a check here, do you see the my presentation?
Yes, it looks great.
Okay, great. Well, I just wanted to thank you again and thank to all of our speakers who are here today, and to all who are participating. I know that we're coming now, I believe, on the 25th year mark for this amazing strike force, and it's just unfortunate how just in the past few years of that time period, methamphetamine has continued to be a scourge on our district. But I completely echo what James Montaigne said, that for as discouraging as some of the stats are, not only with respect to methamphetamine, but as to fentanyl, the resolve of our community, in my mind, overwhelms the bad news, and the good news about the resolve of our community and how united we are, in my mind, is the key takeaway that I have seen from my experience in serving in this position as U.S. Attorney. It truly is a special opportunity, and by a community of leadership, I mean everybody, not just our law enforcement community, those that are involved in prevention and education and treatment, our healthcare providers, our child welfare services, our neighborhood coalitions and leadership. It's really all of us who have pulled together that, in my mind, demonstrate that resolve and are going to be the keys to our success going forward. So what I'd like to do is just take about 15 or 20 minutes to talk through what we're seeing in terms of methamphetamine. Obviously, we want to talk about fentanyl as well. It's difficult to get this group together and not acknowledge fentanyl, but understanding that methamphetamine continues to be a part of this drug crisis that we're dealing with, a significant driver of it. We're going to start with discussing methamphetamine, but I do want to spend some time also talking about fentanyl and the strategies that the U.S. Attorney's Office is using in connection with our many law enforcement, both on the local side and state side, and community partners to address this crisis. So starting with meth, as we know, it is a growing problem. The use disorder statistics are not getting better. Fentanyl again is getting the headlines, but we'll talk about that in a moment. But the meth use disorder statistics are increasing, not just here, but across the nation, and that's fortunately drawing the attention of the best minds, not only in federal government, but also state and local government, not in terms of just law enforcement, but in terms of academia and community leadership, working on drug policies, public safety, law enforcement responses, evidence-based treatments, and groundbreaking research. Our statistics on methamphetamine-related deaths have unfortunately just skyrocketed through the nation. I think as you heard recently just from Dr. Bergman, and I echo those sentiments, he's absolutely right. You know, when we look at the overdose death picture, we're seeing the same statistics. We're talking about a very significant number of those from drug overdoses continue to be methamphetamine, and it's something that needs to continue to get our attention and be part of our strategy. A disturbing trend that we've recently seen over the last year or so are counterfeit Adderall pills. Just recently in 2021, we had a large seizure by our federal colleagues in Rhode Island that involved the seizure of 660,000 counterfeit Adderall pills that contain methamphetamine, led to federal charges by my colleague, U.S. Attorney in Rhode Island. Had a street estimated value of these pills about $4.6 million. Ultimately, and thankfully, in June of 2022, the defendant, Roderick Wilson, 26 years old, was sentenced to 23 years in prison for possessing with the intent to distribute meth and possessing firearms in furtherance of the drug trafficking. This info, as you probably have seen, comes from the report card from the MSF website. I'd point out that from our law enforcement perspective, we've witnessed a massive increase in the seizures of methamphetamine in the last 5 years. As you could see, going back to 2017, our border enforcement officials, CBP, at our ports of entry seized roughly 13.8 thousand kilograms. That amount has gone up substantially by approximately 337% to 60.5 thousand kilograms in 2021. If you compare those numbers, and they're not released yet, to the numbers in 2022, they've gone down in 2022, but we're certainly not doing any kind of victory laps over the drop in meth seizures as overdose deaths continue to skyrocket, and fentanyl seizures actually have gone up significantly from even last year. And many of those fentanyl seizures, as we know, include mixed loads of other drugs, many times mixed loads with methamphetamine. Unfortunately, the increase in methamphetamine related deaths is on the rise. 5 out of 10 involve fentanyl. 179 increase in unintentional methamphetamine caused deaths, and you could see the numbers that just continuously increase between 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, and 2021. A few months ago, in May of 2022, the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, which is responsible for developing our nation's drug control priorities and plans, developed a specific plan to address the use of methamphetamine due to the rising reports of overdose deaths of that drug. Treatment professionals have stated on many occasions that use disorders, among them amphetamine type stimulant use disorders, are among the most difficult addictions to treat. But this plan that was put forth by the White House is a comprehensive plan for effective public health and policy and safety interventions, including various enforcement strategies. I know that many of you watching today are working on many of the priorities that have been announced by the White House. My lane primarily is this first path forward, and this to target the supply reduction and trafficking. And we've done that. In Southern District of California, we have had some significant seizures just in the last 2 years or so. Many of these have been at the port of entry from our hardworking law enforcement partners with CBP and the Port Authority, and the field operations. In Otay Mesa, for example, officers discovered about 1,200 packages of meth that was hidden inside a shipment of onions just in this past February. One of the most significant seizures in San Diego history was in July of 2022. Here's a big picture of that seizure with our canine Milo couching in front of more than 5,000 pounds of methamphetamine. This case involved 4 defendants. All Tijuana residents were allegedly spotted unloading dozens of boxes from a truck in National City. The load turned out to contain more than 5,000 pounds of methamphetamine, and it was at that time one of the largest seizures in San Diego. Law enforcement trailed the truck as it went to Hoover Avenue and 30th Street and arrested the men after allegedly seeing them move the cardboard boxes from the truck into a van. That was a lot of meth, but the absolute largest seizure in our district, which broke the record at the time for the nation, was this one. It was more than 3 times the amount that was depicted with Milo in my previous slide. This was in November of 2021. We had a record-breaking seizure of 17,584 pounds of methamphetamine, and also it was a mixed load. It had 388 pounds of fentanyl. It was taken from a commercial trailer attempting to enter the United States at the Otay Mesa port of entry. It was just a staggering seizure that demonstrates the current fight against the mass production of methamphetamine and fentanyl that we're dealing with. The driver's manifest in that case indicated his trailer contained auto body parts, but different anomalies were detected in the trailer. From an X-ray machine and a drug-sniffing dog, officials found the packages of drugs in the trailer that contained also a few automotive body parts. Carlos Quintana Arias was sentenced in federal court in October. He received 108 months in prison for his role in that smuggling attempt. Just to kind of put things into perspective overall in terms of the kind of where drug prosecutions have gone in the Southern District of California, and this would include all of our prosecutions for both San Diego and Imperial County. But in fiscal year 2021, prosecutions for all related drugs was close to 60% of all the cases that we were handling. This is a remarkable statistic, because if you were to slide back this pie chart and look at it in 2018, it would have been a much different picture, where it was about 23 or 24% of our prosecutions were for drugs, and many more were for immigration. So it just shows you that the amount of resources that need to be shifted in order to meet just this significant volume of drugs that are coming across the border in the last 2 years. Specifically as to our meth prosecutions, you can see that there's been a substantial increase from fiscal year 2011 to 2021. 735 defendants were charged in 2011. In 2021, that number has gone up to 1,709. So it is I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about fentanyl, again, because it's so often that we're seizing mixed loads of both fentanyl and methamphetamine, but it has just become an overwhelmingly tragic situation in terms of the impact that it's having, not only in terms of our district, but our nation. The amount of seizures in the Southern District of California are just overwhelming. Over a 400% increase from fiscal year 2017 to 2022. You may have seen some press on this. I've tried to be on the news both nationally and locally as much as I can, just to call attention to this. But if you look at CBP statistics, approximately 60% of all the fentanyl that has been seized throughout fiscal year 2022 and throughout the nation has been seized in our district. 60%. It is just a staggering amount of fentanyl that has been seized at our ports of entry and in our district. Unfortunately, the deaths are equally staggering. For those who are familiar with the investigations of these cases, loads that are often coming through our ports of entry and into our district, many of those don't stop here. They go to distribution hubs up in Central District of California and throughout the nation. But certainly our district has suffered directly from the distribution and sales of fentanyl. The amount of deaths in 2021, according to the San Diego County Medical Examiner, were up to 814, a significant increase since 2016. And unfortunately, we're on that same trajectory for 2022. Our approach when it comes to fentanyl is similar to what it is for methamphetamine. We were attacking those that are involved in the manufacturing, importation, and distribution of fentanyl at every level. And that means targeting those responsible for bringing chemicals into our country, from the precursor chemicals from China and India, the Mexican drug trafficking organizations and drug labs that make those, that take those chemicals and make pills and powder. The cross-border and transportation cells located in Tijuana that are responsible for loading up the cars with the drugs and bringing them into our country, and the distribution and street level dealers that put those drugs in the hands of those who are addicted and are causing death. We've had many prosecutions in the last 2 years, and particularly the last year, that focus on fentanyl. I can tell you that we are all in. We have about 150 lawyers in this office, and there are very few of us who have not handled a case that in some way involves fentanyl in the last 2 years. And that is going to continue to be the case. It will continue to be a priority as long as it poses a significant danger and threat to the safety and well-being of our citizens. Our prosecutions, in fact, are up significantly since fiscal year 2017, staggering, really, up more than 1,800%. I can tell you that number of 316 defendants that we have prosecuted in fiscal year 2022 is more than 3 times the amount of any other district that is close behind us in terms of prosecutions of fentanyl, more than 3 times. Many of our lawyers and a lot of our effort has been focused on things, on types of cases that traditionally have not been handled by federal prosecutors, and those are cases where we are seeking justice for individual overdose victims that are dying from receiving fentanyl on the streets of San Diego. There is, unfortunately, on the state side, a lack of statutory deterrence that provides for significant penalties, whereas we can do that on the federal side. We have a federal statute that if you are responsible for selling fentanyl, and we can prove that that resulted in the death of somebody else, then you're looking at a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in federal prison. It is a significant deterrent that we have, a significant tool in our prosecution toolbox that we have been using at great lengths in the Southern District of California. We brought about 40 of these cases. In the last year alone, we have sentenced 11 defendants to lengthy prison terms for selling fentanyl that resulted in the death under this statute, and we're going to continue to bring those cases. We've also engaged in a significant amount of community outreach that involves several aspects, and one of our strategies has been to literally announce the stiff penalties that can come from selling fentanyl. This is an example of a poster that we have put up in the pedestrian walkway at the ports of entry with permission of our partners at CBP. And we know that beyond enforcement, that we have to take action to prevent further overdoses and the further victimization of our citizens. James is absolutely right that we cannot prosecute our way out of this crisis. It involves a multiple-pronged approach, not only collaboration with our law enforcement partners, but with many others to raise awareness, to further prevent overdose deaths, harm reduction, and treatment. To that end, we have devoted many of our efforts with respect to community outreach in the last year in particular to adding to and enhancing our fentanyl toolkits that contain the information for parents. At the end of the day, arming our parents and our other loved ones and our members of our community, our neighbors, our friends with the dangers of fentanyl is going to be a key to our success. And the message is getting out there. I can tell you that I have had several meetings with parents in different forums. We've had meetings with kids in classrooms. There is a significant increase in the awareness of fentanyl, even at the middle school level, where we have kids that are telling us what they know about fentanyl, recognizing the dangers, and expressing a commitment to not only avoid drug use, but making sure that they take action with respect to their loved ones and their families to prevent them from suffering as well.
Good morning. My name is Caroline Stevens, and I am a senior research analyst with SANDAG. And today I'm going to present some recent trends in the drug use population among our arrestee population from our substance abuse monitoring program. So the Substance Abuse Monitoring Program, or SAM survey program, was funded by NIJ starting in 1987, and then we switched over to local funding in 2004. We've carried that through to today. When federal funding for the program, formerly known as the Arrestee Drug Abuse Monitoring Program, or the ADAM program, was suspended, San Diego was and continues to be the only site to continue to fund this project uninterrupted. And now we have this really rich sample of drug use data and history for the region. So in 2021, this data collection effort was supported by the San Diego Imperial High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area, or HIDTA, Health and Human Services, Behavioral Health Services, the District Attorney's Office, and the Public Safety Group. And we are deeply grateful for their support, as well as the support of the chiefs and sheriffs, and especially the sheriffs for allowing our team to interview in the jails. So I know some of you may already be familiar with the SAM program, but for those of you who are new to this data, I just wanted to provide a brief overview on what the program is and the stats that we're going to talk about today. So basically, arrestees are approached using a random sampling method within 48 hours of their booking into jail. And if the arrestee is available and willing to participate in a confidential interview, they are asked a series of questions related to their drug use history. And they're asked to provide a urine sample for drug testing. Urine samples are confidential to protect the privacy of the individual. And these data have been reported on an annual basis, and they provide extremely useful and timely information to policymakers, law enforcement, and prevention and treatment professionals. So with that, let's dive in and begin looking at some of the important findings from this year. First, let's talk about our sample, though. So in 2021, this program interviewed 305 adults from Central Jail and Las Colinas, and then 55 youth from Juvenile Hall and the Achievement Centers. And for those of you who don't know, the Achievement Centers launched by the County of San Diego in fiscal year 2020, and the purpose of them is to provide at-risk youth and youth on probation with after-school programming and divert them from attention. So essentially, it's a similar population to those who would be in the hall. But it's important to note that the youth in the achievement centers do not provide a urine sample just due to legal ramifications. So as you can see from this slide, our adult sample was heavily male, ages 18 to 17, with a mean age of 36, 40% Hispanic, 34% white, and about half, 48%, were being booked for a violent charge. In terms of our youth sample, again, it was more heavily male, which makes sense. Our mean age was 16, with a range of 13 to 19. This sample was a little bit more heavily Hispanic and Black, and 51% were booked on a violent charge. So that's kind of the population that we're dealing with. This next slide is diving into one of the most important questions that we can answer with this survey, which is how many people have tested positive for at least one substance within 48 hours of being booked into jail. And the substances that we test for in this survey, as part of this survey, are marijuana, meth, cocaine, opiates, and PCP. And as you can see from the top blue line, which represents adult males, 83% tested positive for at least one substance, which is the highest percentage in the last 20 years. Conversely, only 60% of adult women tested positive for a substance, which is the lowest percent on record since 2008. We're not sure why this happened, possibly just variation in the sample or a change due to COVID booking policies of what types of women were in jail, but we are really interested to keep tracking this and see what happens next year. And then this green line at the bottom represents juveniles. And the rate that juveniles are testing positive remained fairly constant since 2019, ranging from 62% just down to 58%. So fairly constant in the last few years, but this is a big jump from that dip that you see a few years back. So this is kind of one of the more interesting ways that we can represent the data, which is we're looking here at the percent of adult males and females who test positive for a drug in line with kind of different legislative interventions that have happened. So as you can see, we start on 2010, and then in 2011, AB 109 occurs, and you can see it just starts to rise for males. Then Prop 47, which did no favors to our drug court program, and you can see again, continues to rise for males all the way through to the end. Same for females, continuing on, except at the very end here, where we think there's just been an effect due to COVID-19. So we know that through these different legislative interventions, it's basically pushing this kind of drug using really ingrained population back out onto the street. And there's really no incentive for them to stop using because there's a low risk that they're going back to custody or supervision at a lot of points here. So just something to keep note of in terms of the data story and how legislation has played into that. We also wanted to understand, did this vary by the type of crime that people are being booked for? And it really didn't too much. So at least 2/3 or more of adult arrestees tested positive for a drug in 2021. And as you can see, it doesn't particularly matter. It's even less so for people who are being booked on a drug crime, 67% versus 76% for a violent crime, 79% for a property crime or testing positive for at least one drug. And then over here, you can see the percentages of people who are testing positive for multiple drugs based on crime type. So yeah, it's really not just people who are being booked for those drug crimes, it's property, violent, anything. And this really jives with a lot of the information that we get when we do focus groups with our police officers, where I think we ask, them for another project that we do, like, how often do you think people are inebriated or on a substance when you're interacting with them? And the basic response that we get is all the time. So that kind of backs this up. So a lot of people ask us, okay, well, you guys are testing for marijuana. Maybe everybody's just, testing positive for marijuana. That's not a big deal. And largely the answer there is no, that's not true. So we wanted to drill down on the types of drug use and the severity. And what's interesting here is that of those who tested positive for marijuana, 65% also tested positive for another drug. And only 35% of those who tested positive for marijuana were just using marijuana. And we were also curious with the legalization of marijuana through Prop 64, how arrestees are getting access to marijuana. And slightly more than 2/3 of arrestees who had obtained marijuana in the last 12 months reported accessing it multiple ways. So through a street vendor, through a dispensary, a delivery service, and then other. And as you can see from the chart on the right, 72% of arrestees with multiple ways of getting marijuana reported getting theirs on the street, and just 42% of those with just one way reported getting street access as well. So it's still really popular to buy marijuana outside of a dispensary or a legal venue. That's what we learned from this question. So another key point about marijuana is that among juveniles and youth that we interviewed, 91% had reported trying marijuana, with lower percentages reported for alcohol and tobacco. So marijuana is really kind of the substance of choice right now for youth. 67% had used marijuana in the past 30 days compared to just 40% for alcohol and tobacco. And those who used marijuana did so more often than those who used alcohol and tobacco. And additionally, 88% reported it as being very easy to obtain, all of which indicate that this is kind of the predominant substance for youth right now. So Another really interesting thing is that only 11% of the youth surveyed perceived marijuana as bad or extremely harmful, and then like compare that to some of our more serious drugs, which are meth, crack, and heroin at 100% of a response there. So we wanted to look at this compared to alcohol and tobacco and see if the perception of change had changed over time for those other two groups. And the answer is it really hasn't. So in 2007, 42% of juveniles thought that marijuana was bad or extremely bad, compared to just 11% in 2021. And that really hasn't changed in the same manner for alcohol and tobacco. So there's clearly a narrative going on that marijuana is, not that harmful. Maybe it's helpful with anxiety, things like that, where youth are really kind of clinging on to that and not being so thoughtful about using it, maybe. Another important trend shown in the data is that vaping among youth surveyed is extremely popular, with 87% reporting that they had vaped at least once, and 80% had used a vape with a THC product. 83% of those who had tried it prefer it to cigarettes, and 54% think it's less harmful than smoking. So again, vaping is a huge trend that we're seeing among youth in our surveys. So just to kind of bring it back to what this committee is about, meth is still the primary drug used by individuals booked into San Diego County jails. 58% of males tested positive for meth in 2021. That's another 20-year high. And 44% of women tested positive, down from 66% several years ago. But again, we think this is just due to some sample variation and just perhaps a different sample of women being in jail during COVID. We're going to look and see what happens with this next year as well. When we drill further into meth use, a 5-year comparison shows that a lower percentage of arrestees in 2021 compared to 2017 said that the quality of meth was worse this year. More said the price was lower, and around the same percent said it was more available. So this is just kind of some questions that we always get, or feedback that we always get about what is the supply looking and feeling like to arrestees. And yeah, these are some of the trends that we were able to unearth this year. When looking at the percent of adults positive for opiates, opiate use was more popular among females than males in 2021, with 9% of females testing positive and 7% of males. And this is down from a high of 15% several years ago for females. So again, looking to see what happens with that in the future. And also, we looked at arrestees who tested positive for meth, and we wanted to know if they were also testing positive for opiates, because we know there can be a lot of co-occurring use there. And 12% of those positive for meth also tested positive for opiates, compared to just 2% of those not positive for meth. So we are seeing a higher rate of people using both types of drugs at the same time. And then, of course, we wanted to ask about fentanyl, just because it is such a hot topic at this time. And we know that there's been a lot of overdose deaths due to fentanyl just rising in the county over the last several years. So among those testing positive for meth, 18% said they would be open to buying a drug with fentanyl in it, as opposed to just 5% of those who were not positive for meth. We see an even more pronounced response here among heroin users, where 59% said they would be open to buying a drug with fentanyl, compared to just 8% of those who are not positive for heroin. And keep in mind that only 12% in our overall sample would be willing to buy a drug with fentanyl. So really, it's those heroin users that are looking to key into fentanyl use as well for maybe the same type of high. So when we asked arrestees if they thought they had ever used a drug containing fentanyl, just based on a reaction they had, among those positive for meth, 45% thought they had used a drug that contained fentanyl. And among those positive for opiates, 75% thought they had used a drug that contained fentanyl, compared to just 15% and 28% of those not positive for meth and opiates, respectively. So again, we can see that those opiate users are really also okay with using fentanyl if it presents itself in a lot of situations. From there, we also wanted to ask about naloxone administration or Narcan, and 65% who have overdosed have had naloxone or Narcan administered. 39% had gotten it twice, 39% had gotten it once, 31% had gotten it twice, and 31% had gotten it 3 or more times. The most common administrators were fire and EMS, 62%. Friends at 38% and law enforcement at 21%. And 62% of those who got it from fire and EMS and 43% from law enforcement said they got information about treatment when they got that. So that's actually pretty amazing. So yeah, those are just some of the basic stats. This publication is about 40 pages long, so there's more to dive into on our website. I've listed the link there.
I was surprised when they asked me to speak. There's so much collective knowledge here that I'm not sure what I can say that you don't already know. I mean, I have firsthand experience with meth addiction and where that can take someone, but I don't think I'm the only person here who can say that. I am a recovering meth addict. My using led me to being homeless in downtown San Diego for 3 years, and I was arrested at the border for being a drug courier, a drug mule bringing meth across the border, one of the people Mr. Grossman was speaking about. My meth use took me to the streets and then to prison. But my life is more than addiction and crime. I am also a published author, and I was a college professor for 15 years. I got sober in 2006, and during my years sober, I built a career in social services. I was raised in a Buddhist family, and I embraced my Buddhist practice as an adult. I've been very involved in my spiritual community. And when I just want to say, because of the earlier presenter who talked about the Buddhist monks, when I say that I was a professor or a writer and also a meth addict and a homeless felon, people are a little surprised. But when I say I'm Buddhist, people are very surprised. So I don't know what that's about. But yes, I guess even Buddhists do use meth sometimes. The reason I talk about all this is because my crime and my addiction do not define me. I have done meth. I have done so much I'm ashamed of. I've damaged myself. I've hurt people I love, and I've lived on the fringes of society. But I've also done a lot of things I'm proud of. I think every person addicted to crystal meth is much more than just a drug addict. People usually describe how their addiction started and progressed, but I'm not really going to go into that. Let me just say that I did not grow up in a troubled home. I did not live in a bad neighborhood. My mom was an immigrant from Japan, and my dad was the son of Mexican immigrants. They met when he was in the Air Force, and they worked hard to make sure I had good opportunities. I was a good student. I went to good colleges, and I didn't get into trouble. It made me very happy to make my parents proud. And basically, in high school, I was the bookworm. I was the teacher's pet. I was, whatever. I was that person. My high school nickname was Professor. I didn't even have my first drink of alcohol until after I graduated from high school. And I was 34 years old when I tried crystal meth for the first time. I was already teaching college. But I made up for lost time. In my opinion, addiction does not discriminate. It doesn't give a damn about where you come from, where you went to school, or how prestigious your job is. I think the opioid epidemic among young people proves that. I moved to San Diego in 2007, and like I said, I was sober, and I didn't return to teaching. Instead, I wanted to use my experiences in addiction and went into social services. Fast forward to 2015. I relapsed after many years sober. When I made the decision to get high one time for one night, I had no idea that within 2 years, I'd lose my job, my car, and my home. 5 years later, I wound up in federal custody, facing a lot of years in prison. Here's the thing. I knew better. I was in recovery. I know where addiction takes us from firsthand experience. And in my job in social services, I worked with people whose lives were destroyed by drugs. I knew. But when that moment came and the drug was right in front of me, all that understanding did not help me. I thought I was going to get high that night and then get right back on the sober bandwagon. I had no idea that using just this once would open a door I wouldn't be able to close. And by the way, I tried. I went into treatment many times, including after I lost my home. Sometimes I was court-ordered into treatment. I relapsed each time, and I often left treatment to get high. In June of 2020, I was arrested as a drug courier. If it's okay, I'm going to describe how I wound up doing that. At the beginning of 2020, I had only a vague understanding of COVID and what might be coming. Remember, I was living on the streets and I wasn't watching a whole lot of news. I heard rumors that they were going to shut down the streets and that homeless people would be arrested or even fined thousands of dollars just for being outside because we couldn't follow the stay-at-home orders. Like a lot of homeless people, I was scared and was trying to figure out how to get off the streets. Then all of a sudden, in mid-March, everything shut down. Residential programs I tried to get into suspended new admissions. All 12-step recovery meetings, all self-help meetings were suspended. Churches closed. There was an expansion of shelter beds, but the rollout was rocky. I remember one day I walked up to the convention center to ask if I could get a bed, and they wouldn't actually talk to me. They talked to me through a door, and they told me they weren't doing admissions like that. The only way I could get in was through the hot team. I think at the time there were like 2 vans canvassing the entire city. And I want to say I wasn't able to get help getting into a shelter from the hot team, but those people do a lot of really good work. I know that there's like 8 vans now, but the need is so great. And I think that they make heroic efforts and help a lot of people. But in 2020, it felt like every door was closed to me. I couldn't get into treatment. I couldn't get a shelter bed. Every homeless service provider where I went to for help was closed, including places where I used to go shower or eat. Life on the streets is never easy, but all of a sudden it was treacherous. I felt trapped and frantic, like a rat in a cage trying to scratch and scrabble a way out. I don't use heroin, but I began to think a heroin overdose might be a smart choice. I'm aware in retrospect that if I'd held out, things would have changed. But that's a perspective I have sitting at this end of things. At the time, I had no idea what was going to happen, if anything was ever going to open up again. It just felt like the streets were deserted, doors were closed, and I was left to fend for myself. So this was my state of mind when I ran into somebody on the trolley who was also homeless, and he suggested that I go down with him to Tijuana. He stayed down there, as do many homeless people, because it is much cheaper to live. A hotel room in Tijuana costs around $10 or $15, and you can get a good plate of food for less than $5. Drugs are cheaper down there as well. He took me down there with him. He introduced me to somebody who gave me drugs for free, and that man let me stay indoors, and he offered me a chance to make some money. Drugs and cash have a powerful allure to anyone who is impoverished and addicted, and he dangled them in front of me. It was as powerful and as coercive as a gun to the head. On the streets downtown, I knew for years people who made money carrying dope across the border, and sometimes they'd ask me if I wanted to check it out, but I always refused. Being arrested for petty crimes was one thing, but I had priors, so committing a federal felony seemed really, really stupid. I knew with my record I was definitely going to get flagged at the border and was going to be arrested. But that night, when this man got me high and offered me money, I felt like I had no other options. And it's difficult to explain that to you. I knew that it would lead to my arrest, and I did it anyway. But the risk just didn't matter. I don't think I can describe how compromised my thinking was, from being high every single day, from feeling scared and desperate, from living a life in constant crisis, and from the thousand tiny erosions of my integrity, my values, and my good sense. It's hard for me to explain how much it meant to me that someone gave me a warm place to stay, got me high, and offered me a chance to make the most money I'd had in a while. I felt grateful to him. I felt like I owed him. And so that's how I started doing what I did. And obviously that led to my arrest. But I want to talk about, kind of take a different perspective and tell you all of the things that kind of happened to me in my addiction. I hurt and disappointed the people I loved. I betrayed my values and I destroyed my integrity. I lost my home, my car, my life savings, and my retirement. I also lost my entire library, and if you know anything about me, you know how important my books are to me. I lost all of the writing I had ever done, a lifetime of work. Not only did I lose my career, I gave up several of the most productive years of my working life. I became homeless and I lived on the streets. I was physically injured many times. I was hit by a car crossing the street. I was assaulted and beaten up and robbed more times than I can count, sometimes at gunpoint or facing a blade. I woke up twice in a hospital because of overdose. I had emergency surgery because of an abscess on my arm, which became septic, and I contracted HIV and hepatitis C. And I spent years of my life in county jail or federal prison. The thing is, my story is not exceptional. I know many people who have experienced much worse than me and for much longer. Sadly, a lot of us become defendants in the Southern District of California. If someone who is addicted to meth doesn't get help and isn't able to stop, then what I talked about are just some of the consequences. Many homeless drug addicts find our way to Tijuana because drugs are cheap and the border is easy to cross. There are trap houses where people buy drugs, get high, and stay for several hours, where homeless from both sides of the border congregate, and where people are recruited to become drug mules. People there are broke, dope sick, and desperate. To the people who recruit us, we are an extraordinarily cheap way to ferry drugs across the border. They see us as worthless junkies, and if we're willing to put our freedom at risk just to get high, then why not give us what we want? What they do is ugly, disgusting, and exploitative. Indigent drug addicts make great mules. We don't judge. We are satisfied with shockingly little money, and we are willing to put ourselves at great risk of injury and arrest. Once arrested, we don't know enough to give useful information to law enforcement. We are forgotten, and the drugs we carried are just written off, and we routinely face prison sentences of 5 or 10 or more years. So in my case, it was a little different, and people who were arrested around the same time I was, at the beginning of the pandemic and during the height of the pandemic, we got a little bit lucky, at least here in San Diego. I won't go into details about how COVID impacted federal detention, except to say that it was really rough and that there were a whole lot of court closures and a whole lot of delays. So I would, like, for example, many of us were held in detention awaiting sentencing far longer than was normal. I was held in federal detention before sentencing for a year. When Mr. Grossman became acting U.S. attorney for this district, many cases were reviewed, and many of us were offered new plea agreements in which there was no mandatory minimum sentence. Instead of 10 years or even 5 years, the judge in my case was free to sentence me to a term he felt was just and correct. So he sentenced me to 2.5 years, and I wound up serving just about 25 months in custody. I mentioned Mr. Grossman because his name and signature were on my paperwork, and I feel indebted to him. To be honest, I feel grateful to him. I want to close by saying some things that are obvious. Active addiction destroys lives, and once an addict becomes homeless and a criminal, it leads to very ugly and very violent places. I am not dead and dismembered somewhere in Mexico. I'm not wandering the streets of San Diego or Tijuana lost in psychosis. I'm not leading a dangerous, violent, and criminal life. And I'm not exaggerating. These things happen. I count myself lucky that my road led to prison and not to somewhere far, far worse. And if my prison led me back to recovery, then I am very grateful for it. I was taken into custody on June 18th, 2020, and today I am a very different person than I was then. For one thing, that was the first day I didn't use any drugs. As of today, I have been free of all chemical intoxicants for 2 years, 5 months, and 2 weeks. By the time I became homeless, I had given up any hope that recovery would be possible for me ever again. And talking to you, clean and sober, that actually feels like a miracle to me. I believe my time in custody helped me to secure my early recovery. But I also think that every single treatment opportunity I had played a role, even the ones I walked out of, even the ones I refused. I failed so many times at treatment, but I still think every one of those times taught me something. And when I hit the lowest point of my life, when I thought my life was completely worthless and I wished it was just over, all of it came together. All the love from my friends, all the support of counselors, treatment providers, and therapists, and even the incarceration. It all came together at a crucial moment, and I was able to change my mind and change my behavior. I wanted to do it earlier, but I just couldn't. And then I could. Part of my journey is also my journey as a writer. Those first few weeks in prison, I started writing and I wrote a lot. I had such strong and vivid memories of being homeless. And as much as I wanted to put all that behind me, it came out on paper. And then a friend told me about the Penn Prison Writing Awards. And so I submitted some of that work. And when I finally came home to San Diego, I was greeted by the news that I had won the award. I feel grateful to have these stories to tell. There aren't any books that tell the stories of life on the streets. I don't know how good my story is, but it is my story, and I want to tell it. I was sober for many years when I relapsed in 2015. I was lost in shame, anger, and self-hatred. How could I let this happen to me? Why couldn't I stop using? I lived in active addiction and completely without purpose, without faith, and without any hope I could lead a better life. But I don't feel that way today. I am 56 years old. I live in a transitional sober living home, and I have a job working for a nonprofit organization called Playwright Project, which does amazing work. Among other things, they take playwriting workshops into state prisons. My work is being published in an anthology of writing by PEN America, and that book launch is actually today. And I'm working on turning the winning piece into a book. I don't have much, but I'm proud of myself, and I have hope for the future. Thank you for listening to me. I hope you got something from it. I told you my story, but my point is that every single crystal meth addict has a story to tell. When you think about the addicts you know, the ones in recovery, sure, but even more, the ones who are still in active addiction, their stories are heartbreaking. What we do as addicts is heartbreaking. We don't know when or how things will change, but they do change. People change. I think that's one of the things that make humans different from other animals. We have the capacity to change our minds. I can't tell you why things change for me, but I can say that every single person who tried to help me, every single time a friend tried to talk to me, every time some program gave me food or let me take a shower when I was on the streets, every prayer anyone ever said on my behalf, I think all of this contributed to me having a chance at life today. Again, thank you for your time.